My name is Rebecca, and I'm 38 years old. I work as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup in Austin, Texas. My husband Daniel and I have been married for 12 years, living in a charming two-story house with a wraparound porch that we bought right after our honeymoon. To anyone looking from the outside, we had built the American dream together. Steady careers, a beautiful home, weekend trips to the coast, and dinner parties that our friends still talk about months later. But lately, something had been shifting beneath that polished surface. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it lingered in the spaces between our conversations like a shadow I kept catching in my peripheral vision. Daniel works as a project manager for a construction company that specializes in commercial buildings. He's always been the type of man who commands attention when he walks into a room. Tall, confident, with an easy smile that made clients trust him instantly. For years, I admired how effortlessly he navigated social situations, how he could turn a tense meeting into laughter with just the right comment. But recently, that charm felt different. More calculated, more distant. Like he was performing even when we were alone together. The changes started small. Phone calls that he would take in another room. Weekend work emergencies that seemed to pop up with increasing frequency. Shirts that smelled like unfamiliar perfume when I gathered them for laundry. When I asked about these things, Daniel always had reasonable explanations. The construction industry was competitive. His boss was demanding. He was working longer hours to secure a promotion that would benefit both of us. I wanted to believe him because questioning your husband of 12 years feels like admitting that the foundation of your entire adult life might be cracking. 3 weeks ago, Daniel announced that we were hosting a dinner party for some important clients. He seemed unusually excited about it, more animated than I had seen him in months. He wanted everything to be perfect. The good china, fresh flowers, wine from the bottle we had been saving for a special occasion. He even suggested I wear the emerald green dress he bought me for my birthday last year, the one that still had tags on it because I never found the right event to wear it to. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in a while, I felt like we were a team again, planning something together. The guest list was small but significant. Marcus and Linda Thompson, who owned a chain of upscale restaurants and were considering Daniel's company for their next location. James and Patricia Wells, developers who had worked with Daniel's firm on several high-profile projects. And then there was David Martinez, a newer client who ran a boutique hotel group and apparently had big expansion plans. Daniel mentioned that David would be bringing his wife, someone I had never met before. Her name was Sophia. And according to Daniel, she was charming and sophisticated, someone who would fit right in with our group. I spent the entire week preparing. I researched conversation topics that would interest hotel developers and restaurant owners. I planned a menu that would impress without seeming like I was trying too hard. Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables from the farmer's market, a chocolate tart that took me 3 practice attempts to get right. I cleaned the house until every surface gleamed, arranged fresh peonies in crystal vases, and set the dining room table with our wedding china that we rarely used for anything except holidays. The morning of the dinner party, I woke up with that familiar flutter of nervous energy that comes with hosting. Daniel was already in the shower, humming some tune I didn't recognize. When he emerged, wrapped in a towel with steam still clinging to his shoulders, he seemed different. Lighter somehow. More present than he had been in weeks. He kissed my forehead and told me how grateful he was to have a wife who could handle these kinds of events so gracefully. For a moment, it felt like we were back to being the couple who used to stay up late planning our future together. I spent the afternoon cooking, checking and rechecking every detail. The salmon was perfectly seasoned, the vegetables were roasting at exactly the right temperature, and the chocolate tart was cooling on the counter like a work of art. Daniel came home early to help with final preparations, something he rarely did anymore. He arranged the wine glasses with the precision of someone who genuinely cared about making a good impression. We moved around the kitchen together in the familiar dance of a couple who had hosted many parties before. And for those few hours, the distance that had been growing between us seemed to shrink. The Thompsons arrived first, punctual as always, with Linda carrying a bouquet of white roses and Marcus clutching a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. They were followed shortly by the Wells, Patricia elegant in a navy dress that made me second-guess my own outfit choice. and James already talking about some new project before he had even fully stepped through the front door. The house filled with the comfortable buzz of conversation, the kind of sophisticated chatter that made me feel like we were living the life we had always imagined for ourselves. David Martinez arrived exactly at 7:30, which impressed me because punctuality had become a rare trait in our social circle. He was shorter than I had expected from Daniel's descriptions, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something meaningful from the ground up. But it was the woman beside him who made me stop mid-sentence in my conversation with Linda Thompson. She was stunning in a way that seemed almost effortless. Dark hair that caught the light perfectly, smooth olive skin, and a smile that could disarm anyone within a 10-foot radius. Daniel stepped forward to make introductions, his voice carrying that professional warmth he used with important clients. "Rebecca, I'd like you to meet David Martinez and his wife Sophia." Sophia extended her hand with the kind of grace that suggested she was accustomed to making strong first impressions. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent that I couldn't quite place. "Daniel has told us so much about you and this beautiful home." As we moved into the living room for cocktails, I found myself studying Sophia more carefully. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive salons and personal trainers. Her dress was simple, but clearly designer, and she wore delicate jewelry that caught the light when she moved. But there was something else about her that I couldn't shake. A familiarity that nagged at the back of my mind, like a song I couldn't quite remember. The conversation flowed easily as we settled into our usual party rhythm. Marcus dominated the discussion with stories about his latest restaurant opening, while Patricia offered observations about the local real estate market that made everyone nod appreciatively. David proved to be an engaging storyteller, sharing amusing anecdotes about the hospitality industry that had everyone laughing. But I found myself watching Sophia, noting how she seemed to know exactly when to laugh, when to ask the perfect follow-up question, when to touch someone's arm to emphasize a point. She was working the room like a professional, and she was very good at it. When we moved to the dining room for dinner, I'd arranged the seating carefully to facilitate the kind of business conversations that Daniel hoped would come from this evening. I placed Sophia across from me, where I could better observe the dynamics between her and David, and more importantly, between her and Daniel. The salmon was perfectly cooked, the vegetables were roasted to perfection, and the wine pairings were drawing compliments from everyone at the table. Everything was going exactly as planned, except for the growing unease that I couldn't quite explain. It started with small things. The way Sophia knew exactly how Daniel liked his wine served. The way she laughed at his jokes with just a beat too much enthusiasm. The way she seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, passing him the salt before he asked, refilling his water glass when she noticed it was getting low. These could have been the actions of someone who was simply observant and considerate. But, combined with the way Daniel's entire demeanor changed in her presence, they created a pattern that made my stomach tighten with each passing minute. The conversation continued around the table, but I found myself only half listening to Marcus's latest expansion plans, while my attention remained fixed on the subtle interactions playing out in front of me. Sophia had a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. But her attention seemed to return to Daniel with a frequency that felt deliberate. When he spoke about upcoming projects, her eyes never left his face. When he reached for his wine glass, her gaze followed the movement like she was memorizing every gesture. David, for his part, seemed genuinely proud of his wife. He would smile warmly whenever she contributed to the conversation, occasionally placing his hand over hers in gestures that appeared natural and affectionate. There was nothing in his behavior to suggest he noticed anything unusual about the way his wife interacted with my husband. If anything, he seemed pleased that she was making such a good impression on potential business partners. As I served the chocolate tart, Patricia Wells complimented me on the presentation, and the conversation shifted to entertaining and hosting. Sophia immediately chimed in with stories about dinner parties she had organized for David's business associates. Her descriptions were detailed and impressive, painting a picture of someone who understood exactly how to create the right atmosphere for important conversations. But as she spoke, I noticed how often she glanced at Daniel, as if seeking his approval or reaction to her stories. The evening was winding down when David excused himself to take a phone call from his hotel in San Diego. Some kind of emergency with a large wedding party that needed his immediate attention. He stepped out onto the back porch, his voice carrying faintly through the open door as he handled the crisis with the kind of calm professionalism that successful business owners develop over years of practice. The rest of us continued chatting, but I was acutely aware that Sophia's posture had changed the moment her husband left the room. Yeah. She became more animated, leaning forward slightly when Daniel spoke, laughing with a different quality to her voice. Linda Thompson was telling a story about a disastrous dinner party she had attended the previous month, complete with a kitchen fire and a guest who had too much wine, but Sophia's attention was clearly elsewhere. Her eyes kept drifting to Daniel, who seemed equally engaged in this unspoken conversation that was happening parallel to the one the rest of us were having. When David returned, apologizing for the interruption and explaining that he had successfully resolved the hotel crisis, the dynamic shifted again. Sophia became the perfect wife once more, attentive to her husband while maintaining appropriate social boundaries with everyone else at the table. But I had seen enough to confirm what my instincts had been telling me all evening. There was something between my husband and this woman that went beyond casual acquaintance or professional courtesy. The guests began gathering their things around 10:30, everyone expressing genuine appreciation for the evening and making tentative plans for future get-togethers. The Thompsons were the first to leave, followed by the Wells, who insisted on helping me clear some of the dishes despite my protests. David and Sophia were the last to go, lingering in the foyer as David and Daniel discussed potential timelines for the hotel project they had been negotiating. As they prepared to leave, Sophia turned to me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Thank you so much for a wonderful evening," she said, taking my hands in both of hers. "You have such a gift for making people feel welcome in your home." I found myself studying her face up close, searching for any hint of deception or hidden meaning in her words. Her smile seemed sincere, her gratitude appeared genuine, and yet something about the interaction felt performative, like she was playing a role she had perfected through repetition. Daniel walked them to their car while I began the familiar ritual of post-party cleanup. I could hear their voices through the open front door, but I couldn't make out the specific words. The conversation seemed to go on longer than necessary for a simple goodnight, and when Daniel finally came back inside, there was something different about his expression. He looked energized in a way that I hadn't seen in months, like the evening had given him something he had been missing. We worked together to clear the remaining dishes, falling into the comfortable routine we had developed over years of hosting together. Daniel was more talkative than usual, analyzing the conversations from the evening and speculating about which relationships might lead to future business opportunities. He was particularly optimistic about the potential partnership with David's hotel group, describing the expansion plans in detail and calculating the revenue impact if his company could secure the contract. But even as we talked about the business aspects of the evening, I found myself thinking about Sophia. There had been something almost familiar about her mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the particular cadence of her laughter. It wasn't until I was loading the last of the wine glasses into the dishwasher that the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I had seen her before, not in person, but in a photograph on Daniel's phone that I had glimpsed several weeks earlier when he was showing me pictures from a construction site visit. At the time, he had quickly scrolled past the image, explaining that it was just some people from the hotel group at a project meeting. But now I remembered the woman in that photo, partially obscured by other people, but clearly visible enough for me to recognize her face. She had been wearing different clothes, her hair was styled differently, but it was definitely the same person who had just spent the evening at our dinner table. The implications of this realization sent my mind racing through every interaction I'd witnessed throughout the evening. The familiarity between them suddenly made sense. The way she anticipated his preferences, the way he seemed more alive in her presence, the extended conversation by the car before they left. These weren't the behaviors of people who had just met through business connections. These were the behaviors of people who knew each other well, who had spent time together before, who shared something that went beyond professional relationships. I finished cleaning the kitchen in silence, my hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while my mind processed this new information. Daniel had gone upstairs to change clothes, and I could hear him moving around in our bedroom, probably hanging up his good shirt and getting ready for bed. The normal sounds of our normal evening routine, except nothing felt normal anymore. When I finally went upstairs, Daniel was already in bed with his laptop open, probably catching up on emails or reviewing project schedules. He looked up when I entered the room, smiling with what appeared to be genuine contentment. "That went really well tonight," he said, closing the laptop and setting it aside. "I think David is seriously interested in moving forward with the hotel project, and Sophia mentioned that they're planning to expand into the Dallas market next year. This could be exactly the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for." I nodded and made appropriate responses while I got ready for bed, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the photograph I had seen on his phone, about the way Sophia had looked at him during dinner, about the extended conversation they had shared by the car. I was thinking about all the late nights Daniel had been working recently, all the weekend emergencies that had taken him away from home, all the times his explanations had felt just slightly off, even though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a woman who looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The dinner party had been a success by any measurable standard. The food was excellent, the conversation was engaging, and the business connections Daniel had hoped to strengthen appeared to be developing exactly as planned. But underneath that success was a growing certainty that my husband was lying to me about something significant, and that the beautiful woman who had charmed everyone at our dinner table was somehow at the center of whatever deception was taking place. I climbed into bed beside Daniel, who was already drifting off to sleep, with the satisfied expression of someone who felt the evening had gone exactly according to plan. He murmured something about how proud he was of how well I had handled everything, how impressed the clients had been with our home and hospitality. His words should have made me feel appreciated and valued, but instead they felt like another layer of performance, another carefully constructed piece of the facade we seemed to be building around whatever truth was hiding underneath. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Daniel's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep while my mind refused to quiet down. Every detail from the evening played on repeat like a film I couldn't turn off. The way Sophia's eyes had lingered on Daniel when she thought no one was watching. The slight pause before David introduced her as his wife, as if the words didn't come as naturally as they should have. The photograph I had glimpsed on Daniel's phone weeks earlier, now taking on an entirely different meaning in light of tonight's revelations. Sleep didn't come easily. I found myself staring at the ceiling, tracing the familiar cracks in the plaster that I had memorized over 12 years of marriage. Daniel shifted beside me, his arm brushing against mine in his sleep, and I felt a strange disconnect from the man I had shared a bed with for over a decade. How well did I really know the person lying next to me? How many conversations had we had recently where he was only telling me part of the truth? The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. Daniel was up early, already dressed and checking his phone when I came downstairs to make coffee. He seemed energized despite the late night, practically bouncing on his feet as he scrolled through his messages. "Good news," he said without looking up from his screen. "David sent me a text this morning. He wants to set up a meeting next week to discuss the timeline for the hotel project. I think last night really sealed the deal." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, adding cream to mine while leaving his black the way he preferred. "That's wonderful," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Did he mention anything specific about what they're looking for?" Daniel finally looked up from his phone, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. "Mostly logistics stuff. Square footage requirements, budget parameters, projected completion dates. The usual preliminary discussions before we get into the real details." He kissed my cheek before heading toward the door, grabbing his jacket from the hook in the hallway. "I might be late tonight," he called over his shoulder. "I want to get some initial cost estimates put together before that meeting with David. Don't wait up if I'm not home by 9. The door closed behind him with its familiar click, leaving me alone with my suspicions and the lingering scent of his cologne. I spent the morning trying to focus on work, but concentration felt impossible. Every email I attempted to write seemed to require multiple revisions. Every phone call felt like I was speaking through fog. My colleagues probably assumed I was tired from hosting a dinner party, which was partially true. But exhaustion was only a small part of what was weighing on me. During my lunch break, I found myself doing something I had never done before in 12 years of marriage. I called Daniel's office. Not his cell phone, where he could control the conversation and his environment, but his direct office line where a receptionist would answer and potentially provide information he couldn't filter. Good afternoon, Henderson Construction. This is Monica speaking. Her voice was cheerful and professional, the kind of tone that suggested she genuinely enjoyed helping people. Hi, Monica. This is Rebecca, Daniel Morrison's wife. I was wondering if you could help me with something. My husband mentioned he might be working late tonight on some cost estimates, and I wanted to surprise him with dinner. Would it be possible for you to let me know what time he usually leaves when he's working on these kinds of projects? There was a brief pause, and I could hear the sound of computer keys clicking in the background. Oh, Mrs. Morrison, how sweet of you to think of bringing him dinner. But I'm afraid Mr. Morrison isn't scheduled to be in the office late tonight. According to his calendar, he has a site visit scheduled for this afternoon, and then he's blocked out for an external meeting from 6 to 8. Would you like me to leave him a message that you called? My grip tightened on the phone as I processed this information. An external meeting that he had described to me as working late on cost estimates. Another small lie, but one that fit into an increasingly concerning pattern. No message necessary, I told Monica. I'll just catch up with him at home later. Thank you for your help. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze of productivity and paranoia. Part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation for the discrepancy between what Daniel had told me and what his office calendar showed. Maybe the external meeting was with a subcontractor to discuss those cost estimates. Maybe he hadn't wanted to bore me with the specific details of his schedule. Maybe I was reading too much into coincidences and allowing my imagination to create problems where none existed. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks, knew that I was finally paying attention to things I had been unconsciously ignoring for months. The phone calls taken in other rooms weren't necessarily about work emergencies. The weekend obligations that pulled him away from home weren't necessarily about demanding clients. The unfamiliar perfume on his clothes wasn't necessarily from crowded business meetings. When Daniel came home that evening, he was carrying takeout bags from our favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had accomplished everything on his to-do list. Thought we deserved a break from cooking after all that work yesterday, he said, unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry onto the kitchen counter. Plus, I had some good meetings today, and I wanted to celebrate a little bit. We ate dinner while he told me about his afternoon site visit and the progress being made on a shopping center project across town. His stories were detailed and engaging, full of the kind of specific information that suggested he had actually been where he claimed to be, at least during the earlier part of his day. But when I asked about the external meeting Monica had mentioned, he looked momentarily confused. External meeting, he repeated, as if trying to place what I was referring to. Oh, you mean the thing with the subcontractor? Yeah, that ended up getting moved to tomorrow. I ended up staying at the office later than expected to work on those estimates I mentioned. His explanation sounded plausible, delivered with the same confident tone he used for all his professional updates. But something about his brief hesitation before answering made me file the moment away for future reference. After dinner, we settled into our usual evening routine. Daniel retreated to his home office to catch up on emails while I curled up on the living room couch with a book I had been trying to finish for weeks. The house felt peaceful and domestic, filled with the comfortable sounds of a marriage in its established rhythm. But underneath that familiar comfort, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound coming from Daniel's office. The clicking of computer keys, the brief phone conversations, the occasional laugh that seemed more animated than his usual professional calls required. Around 9:30, I heard him wrapping up his work for the evening. The office door opened and his footsteps moved toward the kitchen, probably to get a glass of water or check that we had locked the back door. I continued reading, or pretending to read, while listening to him move through the house with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. When he joined me in the living room, settling into his favorite armchair with a contented sigh, I looked up from my book and really studied his face. He looked relaxed and happy, more at ease than I had seen him in weeks. There was something almost boyish about his expression, like he was harboring a secret that brought him joy rather than guilt. If he was carrying the weight of deception, it wasn't showing in the conventional ways I might have expected. We talked about mundane things, plans for the upcoming weekend, a movie we wanted to see, whether we should finally replace the aging washing machine that had been making concerning noises for the past month. Normal married couple conversations that felt both completely natural and strangely artificial at the same time. I found myself analyzing every word he said, looking for hidden meanings or inconsistencies that might reveal whatever he was hiding from me. When we went to bed that night, Daniel was more affectionate than he had been in recent weeks. He pulled me closer to him as we settled under the covers, his arm wrapping around me with the kind of casual intimacy that had once made me feel completely secure in our relationship. Now, that same gesture felt complicated by everything I suspected but couldn't prove. "I love you," he murmured against my hair, his voice carrying the drowsy contentment of someone drifting toward sleep. "Last night reminded me how lucky I am to have you as a partner in all this. You made everything perfect, and I know how much work that took." His words should have reassured me, should have quieted the doubts that had been building in my mind. Instead, they felt like another performance, another carefully chosen phrase designed to maintain the illusion of the marriage we used to have. The following week passed in a strange suspension of normalcy and growing certainty. Daniel seemed lighter, more present, more engaged in our daily interactions than he had been in months. He brought me coffee in bed on Thursday morning, suggested we try a new restaurant for Friday night dinner, even mentioned planning a weekend trip to the coast that we had been talking about for years but never quite managed to schedule. His renewed attention should have made me happy. For months, I had been missing exactly this kind of connection, this sense that we were moving through life as genuine partners rather than polite roommates. But now that it was happening, I couldn't shake the feeling that his increased affection was somehow connected to whatever was developing with Sofia Martinez. Like his guilt or excitement or both were spilling over into unexpected kindness toward the wife he was potentially betraying. On Friday afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of going straight home after work, I drove to the downtown hotel where David Martinez's company was renovating a historic building into their newest boutique property. I told myself I was just curious about the project Daniel had been discussing so enthusiastically. I wanted to see the kind of work his company was potentially going to be involved in, to better understand the business relationships that seemed so important to our financial future. The construction site was busy with workers in hard hats and safety vests, the sound of machinery and shouted instructions creating a symphony of productive chaos. I parked across the street and sat in my car, feeling slightly ridiculous for what amounted to amateur surveillance of my own husband's professional life. But as I watched the activity around the building, I spotted a familiar figure emerging from a white sedan parked near the construction trailer. Sofia Martinez stepped out of her car wearing jeans and a fitted blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that somehow still managed to look effortlessly elegant. She walked toward the construction trailer with the confident stride of someone who belonged on the site, someone who was expected and welcome. Through the trailer's windows, I could see figures moving around inside, but the distance and angle made it impossible to identify specific people. I sat there for almost an hour, telling myself I would leave as soon as I confirmed that this was simply a routine business meeting. But when Sofia finally emerged from the trailer, she wasn't alone. Daniel walked beside her, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back as they navigated the uneven ground toward her car. It was a small gesture, barely lasting a few seconds, but it carried an intimacy that went far beyond professional courtesy. They stood talking beside her car for several more minutes, their body language suggesting a conversation that was both serious and personal. At one point, Sofia reached out and adjusted Daniel's collar, a gesture so casually intimate that it made my chest tighten with recognition. This was how people touched when they were comfortable with each other, when they had established patterns of physical familiarity that went beyond handshakes and formal interactions. When they finally parted, Daniel returned to the construction site while Sofia drove away in the opposite direction from where I was parked. I waited another few minutes before starting my own car, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. What I had witnessed wasn't definitively romantic, but it wasn't purely professional either. It existed in that gray area where business relationships cross over into something more personal, more complicated, more dangerous to marriages that depend on trust and transparency. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying those few seconds when Daniel's hand had touched Sofia's back with such casual familiarity. The gesture haunted me through the evening routine of reheating leftovers and making small talk about our respective days. When Daniel asked about my afternoon, I found myself lying with surprising ease, mentioning errands and grocery shopping, instead of admitting I had spent an hour watching him interact with another man's wife. That night, I lay awake constructing and deconstructing explanations for what I had witnessed. Maybe Sophia was simply more hands-on with business projects than most clients. Maybe Daniel was being extra attentive because the hotel contract represented such a significant opportunity for his company. Maybe I was allowing my imagination to transform innocent professional interactions into evidence of betrayal. But no matter how many reasonable explanations I created, I couldn't shake the memory of how natural they had looked together. How their movements suggested a comfort level that typically develops over time and repeated contact. The weekend arrived with Daniel in an unusually good mood. He suggested we drive out to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, something we used to do regularly during our early marriage, but had somehow stopped doing as our lives became more scheduled and predictable. Walking through the stalls of fresh produce and handmade crafts, his arm linked through mine, I felt a disorienting mixture of nostalgia and suspicion. This was the man I had fallen in love with 15 years ago, attentive and present and genuinely interested in spending time together. But it was also potentially the same man who was developing feelings for someone else while maintaining the performance of our marriage. We bought peaches that wouldn't be ripe for several days, and artisanal bread that cost twice what the grocery store charged, falling back into the comfortable rhythm of couples who had been making these kinds of decisions together for over a decade. Daniel seemed genuinely happy, more relaxed than I had seen him in months, and I found myself wondering whether his improved mood was connected to me or to whatever was happening in his life beyond our marriage. Sunday evening, as I was folding laundry in our bedroom, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. He was in the shower, and the sound drew my attention to where he had left the device charging on his nightstand. For 12 years of marriage, I had never looked through my husband's phone. Trust had always been the foundation we built everything else on, and violating that felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But as I stood there with a stack of his shirts in my arms, listening to the water running in the bathroom, something inside me shifted. The phone buzzed again, and I found myself moving toward it before I had consciously decided to break the unspoken rules of our relationship. The screen lit up with notifications, and even without unlocking the device, I could see enough to confirm what my instincts had been telling me for weeks. 2 text messages from Sophia Martinez. The preview text showed only fragments, but what I could see made my stomach drop. Thank you for Friday afternoon, and looking forward to Tuesday when David travels. I set the phone back exactly where Daniel had left it and returned to folding laundry with hands that shook slightly. The implications of those message previews were clear enough that I didn't need to see the full conversations to understand what was happening. My husband was communicating with another man's wife about meetings that coincided with her husband's travel schedule. The business relationship that had seemed so promising for Daniel's career was apparently providing cover for something much more personal. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist and hair still damp, he looked like the same man I had been married to for 12 years. But something fundamental had changed in how I saw him. The easy smile he gave me as he reached for his phone felt performative. The casual way he checked his messages while asking about my plans for the following day felt calculated. Even his kiss goodnight, warm and familiar against my forehead, carried the weight of deception. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. I needed time to think, to process what I knew, and decide what I was going to do about it. Daniel left for the office at his usual time, reminding me to rest and offering to bring home soup if I was feeling worse later. His concern seemed genuine, which somehow made everything more complicated. How do you reconcile evidence of betrayal with a husband who still brings you coffee in bed and worries about your health? After he left, I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring out at the backyard we had spent years landscaping together. The rose bushes were in full bloom, the result of careful planning and patient tending that had taken seasons to achieve. Our marriage had required the same kind of attention, the same commitment to nurturing something beautiful over time. But unlike the garden, relationships could be damaged by forces you couldn't see until the harm was already done. I spent the morning researching David Martinez's hotel company online, looking for any information that might help me understand the timeline of his relationship with Daniel's construction firm. What I found was a successful business with properties across the Southwest, owned by a man who seemed genuinely devoted to both his company and his family. His company website featured several photos of David and Sophia together at charity events and business functions, looking like a couple who had built something solid together. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was another successful marriage, another couple who appeared to have everything figured out, potentially facing the same kind of betrayal that was threatening my own relationship. David Martinez had no idea that his business partnership with my husband might be providing opportunities for his wife to develop feelings for someone else. He was probably at home or in his office right now, making plans for their future while trusting that the woman he married was being faithful to their relationship. By Tuesday afternoon, I had made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to attend David's business presentation at the downtown Marriott, an event I had learned about through his company's website. It was scheduled for Thursday evening, a networking event for hospitality industry professionals that would be open to anyone interested in learning about sustainable hotel development. David would be there as the featured speaker. And if my suspicions were correct, Daniel would find a reason to attend as well. I spent Wednesday evening crafting the perfect plan. I would arrive at the presentation early, position myself where I could observe without being easily noticed, and watch how Daniel and Sophia interacted when they thought they were surrounded by strangers instead of sitting at my dining room table. If I was wrong about what was happening between them, I would apologize to my husband for doubting him and work on rebuilding the trust that had been damaged by my suspicions. But if I was right, at least I would have the clarity I needed to decide what came next. Thursday arrived gray and rainy, matching the heaviness I felt as I prepared for an evening that would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I had been allowing paranoia to damage my marriage. Daniel left for work that morning without mentioning anything about evening plans, which struck me as significant since he usually kept me informed about his schedule. When I asked about his day during our usual morning coffee routine, he mentioned client meetings and paperwork, nothing about industry presentations or networking events. I arrived at the Marriott an hour before David's presentation was scheduled to begin, claiming a seat in the back corner where I would have a clear view of the room without being easily spotted by anyone who knew me. The venue was filling slowly with people who looked like they belonged in the hospitality industry. Well-dressed professionals carrying business cards and the kind of confident demeanor that comes from knowing exactly why you're somewhere. Rebecca's story reveals how betrayal often unfolds in plain sight, disguised as business dinners and professional opportunities. Sometimes the most devastating discoveries happen not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet observations and the courage to trust your instincts. When someone brings their secret to your table, it becomes impossible to ignore the truth that's been hiding behind polite conversations and familiar routines. What do you think of Rebecca's approach to uncovering the deception? Share your thoughts in the comments and follow for more stories about trust, betrayal, and the strength it takes to face difficult truths.